The wooden table caught the light in a dozen small ways. A smear on the polished surface, the glitter of gravy, the shine of the serving spoon as it trembled in someone's hand. Laughter orbited the room like a planet's pale moon. Polite, practiced, a rhythm everyone here had learned to keep time with. I sat at the head of half-empty plates, the smell of roast and citrus filling the corners where old grudges liked to hide. My sister's face was a tight shape across the table, cheeks flushed from wine and something sharper. She had never been a quiet storm. She was the kind that announced itself with a clap and left the furniture trembling. Tonight the clap came early. She pushed her chair back so abruptly the legs scraped like fingernails, and every mouth fell silent like birds startled from a wire. "You are a burden," she said, and the words landed clean and cold as a dropped glass. "We want to live without you." Time narrowed. I remember the way her sentence hung in the air, simple, brutal, the way a blade looks when you see the light run along it. My father's fork stilled over his plate. My mother's hand tightened on the napkin so hard the lace puckered. Cousins glanced at each other, at me, at the sliding open of old arguments like a door that wouldn't quite shut. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. I smiled. It wasn't brave or theatrical. It was small, automatic, the kind of smile you learn to cut glass with. It was a smile that softened the edges of the moment for everyone else, made them more comfortable in their discomfort. They needed the pause. They needed to believe the wound could be trivial. The smile was a gift to them. For a second, the room wanted to believe everything was still manageable. But inside, 1,000 things happened at once. A film of heat rose behind my ribs. Memory unspooled. Nights of trying to be invisible so that people could sleep, afternoons of swallowing apologies, the invisible labor of smoothing the world so others could be normal. I counted the ways they had edged me out. A missed invitation here, an accidental insult there, little clipping scissors of neglect. The sum of it all was the heavy, particular ache that comes from being treated like an expense, a shadow one must tolerate. She continued, as if the words themselves had been rehearsed to taste like victory. "We've given and given. You take and take. It's time." There was triumph in her voice now, a gloating that felt older than the years she'd lived. Around the table, a few faces relaxed, relief like an exhale, as if some family ledger had finally been balanced. I set my napkin down slowly, the linen whispering. My smile tightened into something like calm. I could have answered then with the truth, listed every small way they'd hurt me, every kindness I'd stifled to keep the peace. I could have thrown her words back like stones. Instead, I listened. There is power in quiet, and I needed the contour of their anger to see where it led. Outside, beyond the curtained windows, the night settled in velvet. Inside the house, old furniture and older habits held sway. I had learned to move within rooms like a quiet current, not a ripple at the surface, but a force that shapes the channel over time. Tonight their cruelty was a gust. It would not topple me. Not yet. My smile did not leave my face, but it changed. It became a door. Behind it, something else waited, patience maybe, and a plan. The hungry, polite voices around the table would have their fragment of triumph for now. They would tuck their victory into the folds of family stories and sleep a little easier. But smiling was not surrender. It was reconnaissance. I had watched them long enough to know how to watch back. When the murmurs began to rise again, I spoke, not with the heat they expected, but with a low, steady voice that made the candlelight lean in. The quiet surprised them more than any shout could. And in that quiet, the first small shift took place, the beginning of an answer none of them saw coming. "Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, where the narrator reveals how she masks herself at home, the wounds that led to this outburst, and the first seeds of the plan she begins to weave?" After the dinner ended, the house fell into that strange kind of hush families where when something ugly has been said and no one dares to sweep it up. Dishes clattered in the sink like bones, conversations tiptoed around corners, and my sister's words kept echoing in the woodwork, louder than any closing door. "You are a burden. We want to live without you." The syllables lived on even as people retreated to their rooms, pretending to be busy, pretending not to glance at me. I lingered at the table longer than I should have, my hands resting on the linen as if it could anchor me. The smile was still there, a ghost pressed against my lips, though now it felt like a mask made of glass. Inside I was splintering. But splintering in silence was a language I had mastered. It had started long before tonight. Silence had always been my inheritance. As a child, when my laughter was too loud, I was told to quiet down. When I cried, I was told I was too sensitive. When I succeeded, my victories were met with suspicion, and when I failed, it confirmed what they whispered behind closed doors, that I was fragile, incapable, too much work. Slowly, invisibility became my shield. Better to shrink than to be accused of taking up too much space. But invisibility has weight. Every time I tiptoed to avoid their anger, every time I swallowed my needs because asking would make me demanding, I carried it. The weight pressed down like invisible stones tied to my ribs. And still I smiled. Smiling made it easier for them to ignore the stones, to pretend I wasn't drowning. My sister's words tonight weren't new, they were simply the loudest version of what had always been implied. She had voiced the ledger they'd all been keeping in secret, the cost of my existence. I wondered how long they had rehearsed it in their heads, how long they had been waiting for someone brave, or cruel, enough to say it aloud. I moved to the window then, the glass cold beneath my palm. Outside, the street was empty, just the lamppost bleeding yellow onto cracked pavement. The world looked ordinary, but I knew something had shifted inside me. The mask of silence, the habit of disappearing, had protected me once, but now it was suffocating. I thought about the smile I gave at dinner, how it had frozen their victory in place, how they mistook it for surrender. Let them. They had no idea what lived beneath that smile. Memories kept pulling at me, unwanted. My mother's hand brushing me aside when I tried to help. My father's sigh when I asked a question too many. The way my sister's friends laughed once, cruel and sharp, when she told them I was the family's delicate problem. Even the cousins who looked at me with pity tonight, I remembered their laughter too, how they had once made bets about how long I'd last living on my own. My life had been a series of small humiliations that added up to this moment at dinner, my existence reduced to a burden they were tired of carrying. And yet, something else stirred beneath the pain. It wasn't rage, not yet. Rage is noisy and I had no interest in noise. This was quieter, heavier. It was the slow, deliberate gathering of resolve, like roots tightening their grip beneath the soil. For the first time in years I didn't feel small. I felt still. And in that stillness I recognized something dangerous, the beginnings of power. I turned back to the table where my sister had spat her verdict, and I imagined her face when the balance shifted. When she realized that the one she called a burden could be the one to hold the family's silence hostage, to unearth the truths they buried so carefully. My smile deepened, not out of joy but out of clarity. They thought they could live without me. They were wrong. Upstairs, laughter flickered through the walls, forced, uneven, a sign that they were already moving on. I listened, patient the way I always had. But this time, the patience wasn't born of weakness. It was preparation. They would forget the words spoken tonight, file them away as an outburst, a fleeting cruelty. But I would remember. I would carve them into the marrow of my resolve. The night stretched on, heavy and alive. Somewhere between silence and breath, a decision formed inside me: I would not be erased. Not by their cruelty, not by their ledger of burdens. My sister's words had cut me open, yes, but wounds can become windows. And through this one I saw a path I had never dared to imagine. One where the burden learned how to carry itself and in doing so, made everyone else weigh their own sins. I smiled again, this time not for them, not for disguise. I smiled for myself for the first time in years. The following days felt like walking on a thin sheet of glass, every step deliberate, quiet, measured, yet alive with the potential to crack beneath the slightest pressure. The family carried on as if nothing had happened. My sister laughed a little louder at meals, hoping the sharpness of her words would fade into memory. My parents smiled politely when they passed me in the hallway, glancing toward each other as though the evening's eruption had been nothing more than a passing irritation. But I could feel the fissures they left behind. I moved among them like a shadow that had learned to bend and stretch, carefully watching, listening, cataloging every glance, every sigh, every half-spoken complaint. The smile stayed, folded neatly across my lips like a polished mask, but beneath it, something else was shifting, small, deliberate cracks that let my thoughts and intentions leak through, imperceptible yet dangerous. At breakfast, my sister made her usual attempts at domination, stirring my tea too vigorously, letting her fork graze my plate with exaggerated care, speaking loudly about the future of the family, as if I were not there to hear. I didn't respond. I just smiled, watched, and let her believe she had unsettled me. And yet, each time her words slid off the surface of my calm, I stored them like currency, each insult and slight a coin to be spent later, each act of cruelty a mark on a ledger only I could read. It was not passive resistance. It was a study of rhythm, a calculation of weight and timing. I tested them carefully. A comment slipped through, subtle, so small that even my sister didn't notice it was a slight. A delay in serving someone's request, courteous but slow, just enough to disturb their rhythm. A glance, lingering longer than politeness demanded, to make them wonder whether they had overlooked something. Each minor action was a ripple across the pond of their expectations. And it worked. Cracks appeared. My sister's laugh became brittle, forced. She repeated herself unnecessarily, trying to regain control of a conversation that no longer responded to her usual cues. My parents hesitated more often, consulting each other before speaking, a subtle deference creeping into the space between us. The household, once rigid in its hierarchy, had begun to wobble like a carefully stacked tower of cards. I noticed, too, the things that were not said, the silent calculations in my mother's eyes, the unspoken apology that hovered in my father's posture. Even my sister's friends who visited occasionally seemed to step lightly around me, unsure how to navigate the tension that hummed beneath the surface. The mask was working, but the cracks within it were doing the real work. People underestimate what patience combined with quiet observation can achieve. One evening, I lingered in the hallway after everyone had gone to bed. My sister's room was alive with muffled music, her laughter spilling into the corridor like tiny shards of glass. I pressed my hand to the wall, feeling its cool, solid certainty beneath my palm, and imagined the weight of their judgments pressing back. They wanted me to feel small, invisible, guilty. But instead I felt something else: clarity. I had survived their scorn, their verbal violence, and even their attempts to erase me from the family's narrative. Now I could observe it. Now I could guide it. Each day became a study of balance. I refined the way I moved, the inflection in my voice, the way my eyes lingered just long enough to unsettle but not provoke outright confrontation. My sister tried to provoke me into arguing, into breaking the calm I had cultivated. She thought that if I spoke, I would confirm her claims of being a burden. But silence was my shield, my sword, and my strategy. Every unspoken word became a quiet challenge. I existed, I was capable, and I was aware of every slight. By the end of the week, subtle changes had spread through the household. My sister, who had declared me a burden, now approached me with caution. She double-checked her words, hesitated before laughter, and occasionally even sought my opinion quietly, as if realizing that I was no longer the passive figure she had once dismissed. My parents, too, had begun to weigh my presence differently. I was still their child, yes, but one who had grown eyes behind the polite smile, one who could observe, calculate, and act in ways they could not fully control. The cracks in the mask were not accidents. They were intentional, precise. Each moment of restraint, each smile, each quiet glance, formed a lattice beneath which the family's assumptions began to crumble. They could not see it yet, but a new dynamic had emerged, one where the burden was no longer powerless, no longer silent, and no longer invisible. And I smiled again, inwardly, knowing that the real test was only beginning. Patience had drawn the first lines, but soon, the careful observation would become action. The game had changed. They had underestimated me, and for the first time, I allowed myself the faintest thrill of anticipation. The burden, it seemed, had begun to awaken. The first move had to be invisible. It had to be subtle, almost imperceptible, so that no one could trace its origins back to me. My sister's words at dinner had been loud, cruel, and deliberate. My response now would be quiet, measured, deliberate in a different way. The battlefield was the household itself, and the pieces were every whisper, glance, and decision I had catalogued over years of silent observation. It began with the smallest of interventions. One morning, while my sister was distracted with her own plans, I rearranged the kitchen schedule ever so slightly. The water for tea would come to a boil a minute earlier. The butter would be softened to perfection when she expected it to be cold. The differences were minor, imperceptible to anyone else, but noticeable to her. She would pause, adjust, check again, a subtle disruption to her sense of control. I watched from the doorway, smiling inwardly as her irritation flickered across her features like candlelight caught in glass. Next came the household errands, those little responsibilities she assumed were entirely under her command. I began taking them over quietly, completing them with precision, and leaving her attempts to correct me slightly delayed. A bowl set down an inch off-center, a misplaced napkin, a subtle hint that she no longer had the mastery she believed she possessed. Every small act was a probe, a way to measure her reaction, and every reaction taught me more about how fragile her assumed authority had become. I also began planting seeds with the rest of the family, carefully chosen words that highlighted my reliability. To my mother, I mentioned the way I had noticed the pantry running low before anyone else. To my father, I offered quiet insights about upcoming household repairs. Nothing boasted, nothing confrontational, simply a demonstration of competence and awareness that contrasted with my sister's occasional arrogance and impulsiveness. The gaps between her words and her actions were becoming visible, even to her. Meanwhile, I let my calm smile do the heavy lifting. It masked every calculation, every quiet thrill at her faltering. She could not anticipate what she could not see, and my unbroken composure made it impossible for her to predict my next move. It was the most important weapon I possessed, the illusion of harmlessness. I was the burden, yes, but a burden who listened, observed, and stored knowledge like treasure. One evening, she attempted a direct confrontation, trying to provoke me into a heated argument at dinner. Her voice was sharp, her accusations deliberate, as if she were testing whether my mask had cracks. I smiled, quietly set down my fork, and spoke with calm authority about something entirely unrelated, a minor household matter she had overlooked, phrased as a suggestion rather than a reprimand. Her words caught in her throat, and for the first time she realized that the person she had tried to undermine was no longer reacting on instinct. The household noticed. My father's eyebrows rose slightly, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line, and even the cousins, previously complicit in small derisions, paused mid-laughter. My sister's dominance faltered. It was only a minor disruption, but in that moment, I understood the power of a single move executed correctly. It reshaped the table's dynamics without a single overt confrontation. Over the next week, I began creating small pockets of dependence. I anticipated needs, completed tasks before being asked, and offered insight at strategic moments. My sister's voice grew quieter in the household. She began checking with me almost unconsciously before issuing orders. Her frustration simmered, and I smiled, knowing that subtlety had become my ally. I didn't need to fight openly, I simply needed to guide the currents of attention and expectation. By the end of the week, a pattern emerged. My sister, who had tried to cast me as a burden, now relied on me in small, invisible ways. She could not articulate it, perhaps she would never admit it, but the balance of power had begun to shift. My patience, observation, and calculated calm were redrawing the lines of authority without anyone fully realizing it. And yet, I remained outwardly gentle, polite, and compliant. The brilliance of the first move lay in its invisibility. My sister thought she still held control, while the reality had quietly turned in my favor. Every gesture, every smile, every unspoken word worked together to teach her that underestimating me was her greatest mistake. I knew this was only the beginning. The household, like a garden, needed careful tending. One misstep could reveal my intentions prematurely. But the first move had been made. And from this point forward, the game was mine to guide, one calculated step at a time. The burden had awakened, and she was no longer content to remain invisible. The household had begun to notice subtle changes, though none of them could name the source. I moved through the rooms with the same calm smile, the same quiet efficiency, but each day I tested the invisible lines of control my sister had once assumed were absolute. The first move had shifted the balance slightly, but now it was time to see how far I could stretch the boundaries without revealing my hand. It began with small provocations, imperceptible unless one was paying close attention. I placed items slightly differently than expected, completed tasks on my own schedule, or spoke to other family members in ways that subtly contradicted her assumptions. My sister noticed the deviations instantly, though she could not articulate why they unsettled her. Her eyebrows would knit, her hands would twitch, and for brief moments she would falter in front of the family. I smiled inwardly. Each small disruption was a test of her composure, a measure of how fragile her control had become. Next, I began leveraging my own observations to anticipate needs before anyone could voice them. If my sister intended to delegate a task, I completed it first, leaving her attempts to reassert authority redundant. If she tried to redirect conversation or manipulate attention toward herself, I subtly shifted topics to highlight someone else's input, or offered insight in a way that drew respect from my parents. My actions were quiet, almost invisible, yet the ripple effect was undeniable. I watched as she began to second-guess herself. At dinner, she hesitated before speaking, recalculating her words. In conversations with our parents, she repeated herself unnecessarily, seeking affirmation I had no intention of providing. Each misstep, each pause, was evidence that the quiet burden she had once dismissed was now a force they could not ignore. Even the cousins, previously her loyal supporters, began to watch me differently. A glance I held too long or a word I spoke with measured confidence caused them to falter in their usual teasing. I was no longer the passive observer. My presence shaped the room, shifted attention, and subtly challenged their perceptions of power. But I did not overreach. Testing boundaries was an exercise in precision. I allowed small victories to accumulate without drawing overt attention to myself. I had learned that the most effective influence is often invisible, a gentle tug on the strings while others believe they hold the control. Every moment of hesitation in my sister's actions, every pause she took before asserting dominance, was a small confirmation that the strategy was working. One evening, my sister tried a more direct approach. She cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low but sharp. "Why do you always undermine me? Why can't you just stay in your place?" Her words were an accusation, a challenge, an attempt to reclaim authority. I did not flinch. I smiled softly, calmly, and said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy, forcing her to confront the fact that my lack of reaction was itself a form of power. She stormed off, slamming the door so hard it rattled the cupboards. And in that sound I recognized a victory. Not a dramatic triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement that the household's dynamics had shifted. She was learning, slowly, that control was no longer hers to wield unchallenged. Over the next week I escalated subtly. I offered suggestions in family decisions without seeking approval, corrected minor mistakes gently in conversation, and anticipated issues before they became apparent. Each action was deliberate, a careful probe to map the limits of my influence. The household responded. My sister's tone became defensive, my parents paused before intervening, and even the cousins tread lightly. The balance of attention had begun to tilt. Yet I maintained the outward appearance of compliance. My calm smile, the polite gestures, the measured words, all kept the household from suspecting the depth of my strategy. They saw the same person they had always dismissed, unaware that the burden they had underestimated was quietly reshaping their world. By the end of the week, I had tested nearly every boundary of influence without ever exposing my hand. My sister had faltered multiple times, unsure how to assert dominance, while I remained unshakable, always observing, always calculating. The quiet burden had become a subtle architect, building the framework for the eventual reckoning without anyone noticing the walls taking shape. I smiled again, softly, privately. The tests were complete for now, and the household had provided all the information I needed. I knew the next moves would require courage, precision, and timing. But for the first time in years I felt fully awake, fully capable, and fully alive. The burden was no longer just surviving, it was beginning to thrive. And with every careful step, every silent victory, I knew the family dinner words that had cut so deeply were beginning to lose their power. They had spoken of a burden, but they had not realized they were awakening a force they could not yet comprehend. The household had begun to notice subtle tremors in its foundation, though no one could yet pinpoint the cause. My sister still held the loudest voice in the room, but her words no longer carried the unquestioned authority they once did. I moved among them like a current beneath the surface, unseen but shaping the flow of every interaction. The first test had revealed weaknesses. Now it was time to apply pressure, to shift the balance more decisively. It began with small but visible actions. At breakfast, I anticipated needs before anyone could voice them. A cup of tea brewed to perfection, a napkin folded just so, a chair pulled out without prompting. Each act was performed with calm precision, an unspoken challenge to my sister's assumptions. She noticed immediately, her eyes flicking toward me with that familiar flash of irritation and disbelief. And yet, I said nothing, smiled softly, and let her struggle against the invisible currents I was generating. I also began to influence decisions subtly, offering suggestions that steered conversations without appearing assertive. When my father asked about household improvements, I mentioned minor repairs that I had already addressed. When my mother debated arrangements for an upcoming family gathering, I proposed adjustments that simplified her work. In every case, my interventions were polite, modest, and strategic. They made life smoother, but also highlighted my competence in contrast to my sister's occasional impulsiveness. She attempted to reclaim control, of course. A sharp word here, a pointed gesture there, meant to unsettle me or remind the household of her supposed superiority. But I had grown adept at absorbing these challenges, deflecting them with subtlety. A smile, a gentle nod, or a measured word, enough to acknowledge her attempt without granting her victory. Each failed effort chipped away at her confidence, though outwardly she appeared to maintain dominance. Even the cousins and extended family began to shift their attention. They had once laughed at my timid presence or my quiet compliance. Now they paused, weighing my words before responding, considering my opinions and sometimes even seeking my guidance. The atmosphere was changing. The family structure that had long been rigid and hierarchical began to wobble under the weight of unseen influence. One evening my sister made her boldest move yet. She confronted me directly, raising her voice in front of our parents. "Why do you always interfere? Why must you have a say in everything? You're not in charge here." Her fury was loud, raw, a crescendo she hoped would break the calm I maintained. I met her gaze steadily, my smile unwavering, and replied in a quiet, deliberate voice, "I am not trying to control. I only want to help. If my help is unwelcome, I will step back." Her words faltered. The household held its breath. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, my father's eyes shifted between us. For the first time, the family recognized that my presence could not be dismissed so easily. My sister's attempt at domination had failed. The calm I exuded, the invisible authority I had cultivated, had rendered her rage ineffective. From that night forward, the balance shifted more clearly. I no longer acted merely in response to her movements. I anticipated them, guided them, and, in subtle ways, controlled the direction of household energy. Every task I completed, every suggestion I made, reinforced the truth my sister had tried to deny. I was capable, aware, and increasingly central to the life of the home. The power of observation had matured into action. Where before I had survived through silence and careful calculation, I now exerted influence without needing confrontation. My sister's attempts to undermine me grew weaker, less frequent, while the family, consciously or not, began to follow my lead. The quiet burden was no longer invisible, it was becoming indispensable. By the end of the week, a pattern had emerged. My sister's voice, once dominant and unchallenged, now carried hesitation. She consulted me privately before making decisions, a subtle acknowledgement of my rising influence. My parents, too, relied more on my judgment, slowly shifting the household's rhythm to accommodate my competence. Even the cousins adjusted, no longer mocking but observing, cautious of the quiet force that had awakened in the one they had labeled a burden. I smiled once more, privately, feeling the first true taste of satisfaction. The balance was no longer in her favor. Each small move, each careful decision, had compounded into a force that could not be ignored. I had transformed the household dynamic without a single outburst, without a dramatic confrontation, simply by being present, aware, and strategic. The burden had shifted. It was no longer a label meant to diminish me. It was a mantle I carried with quiet power, shaping the world around me in ways they could neither see nor resist. The first move had been tested. The boundaries had been explored. Now the household belonged to a new rhythm, one I orchestrated with patience, precision, and an unwavering calm. And with every smile, every careful step, every subtle intervention, I knew the next stage of influence would come. The household had begun to bend. Soon it would yield. The transformation was no longer subtle. The household, once a stage for my sister's dominance, now moved in rhythms I had quietly begun to orchestrate. Authority does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it grows in the spaces between words, in the pauses that make others reconsider, in the confidence that does not demand attention but earns it. That was the power I had cultivated, a quiet authority that made the family consult me without realizing why. It began with daily routines. I managed tasks with precision, ensuring everything flowed smoothly, yet never announcing my role. When the morning tea was served, when chores were completed efficiently, when conversations were steered toward productive resolution rather than petty argument, the household's dependence on me grew. My sister noticed, of course. Her attempts to assert control now met with calm resistance. Never confrontation, but an invisible barrier that left her frustrated. She began to question herself more often. Did she really know the sequence for setting the table? Had she overlooked a detail in planning the family event? My subtle interventions forced her to pause, to second-guess, and sometimes to seek my confirmation without admitting it. The once loud declarations of supremacy had been replaced by hesitation and doubt. And every time she faltered, I maintained my serene composure, letting the weight of my quiet authority settle in the room like sunlight over a still pond. I also leveraged perception. Actions performed with calm confidence have a way of convincing observers that they were always correct. I spoke gently but firmly in family discussions, ensuring my input was noticed without overshadowing others. Parents began to glance toward me before making decisions, cousins deferred to my judgment in minor disagreements, and even my sister's friends started asking my opinion, realizing, perhaps unconsciously, that I was competent, reliable, and aware of nuances they had once thought beneath me. In small ways I began to test the limits of my influence. A suggestion here, a gentle correction there, always framed with care. My sister bristled, her eyes narrowing, but she could not counter without revealing her insecurity. The family's eyes now often followed mine, as if my presence had become a lens through which events naturally passed. Quiet authority is insidious in its effect. People adjust their behavior around it even before they understand why. One evening, an argument arose about a minor household expense. My sister attempted to dominate the discussion, speaking louder, emphasizing her points with dramatic gestures. I remained calm, my smile soft, and offered a single well-phrased insight. It was not a correction, not a challenge, simply a perspective she had not considered. The room shifted immediately. Parents nodded, cousins murmured agreement, and my sister's voice wavered. She could not challenge me without exposing her own overreach, yet her dominance had been undermined in plain sight. Her frustration became a new tool for me. Every display of impatience, every tight grip on a cup or fork, revealed her insecurities. I observed and stored, knowing that these moments would be valuable in shaping the family's perception further. Authority, I had realized, was not about winning battles in the open, it was about controlling the currents beneath the surface, guiding the household without overt confrontation. Over the next weeks, my sister's attempts to assert control became fewer and weaker. She would test boundaries but stop short, aware, consciously or not, that I had learned to predict her moves, to redirect them with subtle grace. My presence had become indispensable. Tasks ran smoothly, conversations resolved efficiently, and the household atmosphere shifted toward a rhythm that favored reason, quiet competence, and strategic patience. By now, the family began to rely on me naturally. Requests were made indirectly, suggestions sought with casual phrasing, and even my sister began consulting me privately, an unspoken acknowledgement that her previous authority had diminished. The quiet authority I wielded was no longer invisible. It was embedded in every corner of the household's daily life, shaping decisions, behaviors, and perceptions. I smiled to myself privately, knowing how far I had come. The burden they had tried to cast aside was now a subtle architect of the home, guiding without force, influencing without confrontation, and reshaping power with a steady hand. My sister's loud claims of superiority had been replaced by whispered doubts, my calm competence had earned quiet respect, and the household, unknowingly, had begun to bend to my direction. I understood then that true authority did not need to be demanded. It could be cultivated, grown in the spaces between words and actions, and strengthened by patience and observation. The quiet burden had transformed into a quiet ruler, not overtly dominant, but undeniably influential. And in that understanding, I knew the next stage would require precision, timing, and courage. The household had begun to recognize me, slowly, reluctantly, and in the subtle shift of their gaze, I saw the first signs of real change. The game was no longer about survival, it was about mastery. Dinner that evening carried a tension that had been building for weeks, though no one had named it aloud. The family moved through the motions, the clink of cutlery, the scraping of chairs, polite conversation. Yet beneath the surface, the currents had shifted irrevocably. I had cultivated a quiet authority, tested boundaries, and now, it was time to reveal just how solid my place in this household had become. My sister arrived at the table with her usual air of superiority, expecting her usual deference. She glanced at me, a flicker of unease in her eyes, as though she sensed the storm beneath my calm exterior. I smiled softly, maintaining the composed demeanor that had become my shield and my weapon. The game was about to change, and she would feel the shift in ways she could neither anticipate nor ignore. Conversation began as usual, polite, mundane, a dance of small talk and veiled assertions. I let it flow, listening carefully, observing the subtle signals of tension around the table. Every word my sister spoke, every gesture, betrayed her uncertainty. She tried to dominate discussions about household decisions, expecting the familiar compliance from me. But I had already learned how to redirect without confrontation, how to assert influence through calm authority rather than loud protest. When she attempted to claim authority over the family's upcoming plans, I spoke. Not with anger, not with force, but with quiet precision. I have an idea that might simplify things, I began, my tone measured and confident. If we approach it this way, we could avoid unnecessary stress and ensure everything is ready on time. My suggestion was deliberate, practical, and impossible to dismiss without consequence. The room shifted immediately. My parents nodded subtly, considering my input. The cousins, who had once laughed at me or ignored my presence, leaned in with interest. My sister's face paled slightly. Her plan had been overridden by a calm, reasoned alternative. She could not argue without revealing her insecurity, and she could not accept without conceding authority, a dilemma I had anticipated and orchestrated. As the meal progressed, I continued to guide the conversation with subtle interventions. A gentle correction here, a thoughtful suggestion there, always phrased with courtesy. Each moment highlighted my competence and composure, reinforcing the quiet authority I had cultivated over weeks. My sister's attempts to assert dominance became falteringly weak, each one underscoring the shift in power that had been growing imperceptibly until now. At a critical moment, my sister tried a direct challenge. "Why do you always have to interfere?" she demanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the polite hum of dinner conversation. "Can't you just let me handle things?" Her words were meant to humiliate, to remind everyone of her supposed superiority. I smiled, unflinching, and responded with calm authority. "I'm not interfering. I'm contributing," I said, my voice steady, deliberate. "If my input is helpful, it can prevent mistakes. If not, it can be ignored." The simplicity of my statement left no room for attack. It was measured, irrefutable, and the household sensed it. My sister's lips pressed into a tight line. She wanted to fight, to dominate, to reclaim control. But every attempt was met with patience, observation, and precision. I did not need to raise my voice or demand recognition. The authority I had quietly cultivated over weeks now spoke louder than any outburst could. By the end of the meal, the balance had shifted completely. My sister's influence was diminished, her confidence shaken. My parents, once passive observers, now deferred to me in subtle ways, acknowledging the competence and calm that had always existed beneath the label of burden. Even the cousins and friends who had once mocked or ignored me now treated my presence with a mixture of respect and cautious attention. I left the table that night with the same calm smile, knowing that the household had witnessed the full extent of the shift. The quiet burden they had dismissed was no longer invisible or powerless. The reckoning had occurred not with anger or confrontation, but with measured, deliberate authority that left no doubt of my strength and influence. As I moved through the house afterward, I could feel the subtle tremors of recognition and unease ripple through my sister. She had underestimated me for too long, and the consequences were undeniable. The household's dynamics had been reshaped, and I, the one they once called a burden, had become indispensable, respected, observed, and quietly in control. And in the silence of that night, I smiled once more, privately, knowing that the family had learned a lesson they would not soon forget. The one they had tried to dismiss was neither weak nor powerless. I was here, fully aware, fully capable, and quietly, profoundly in command. The days after the dinner reckoning were quiet but charged. The household had shifted, though the change was not yet fully acknowledged by anyone, not even my sister. She still carried her usual air of entitlement, yet her movements were cautious, her words carefully measured. My task now was to consolidate the influence I had so meticulously cultivated, transforming the subtle authority into undeniable presence and control. I began by observing even more closely. Every glance, every hesitation, every small decision revealed the true dynamics of power within the family. My sister's uncertainty became a tool. Each falter, each silent pause, an opportunity to guide, correct, or subtly redirect. My parents too were watching differently. I could see them weighing my words with more attention, considering my perspective before making decisions, and silently acknowledging my competence. The household's dependence on me was growing, and with it, my quiet authority solidified. Small, deliberate interventions became my method of reinforcement. I anticipated problems before they arose, offering solutions before anyone else noticed the need. I completed chores efficiently, not for recognition, but to demonstrate that competence did not need loud announcements. I spoke during family discussions only when my input could guide them toward clarity, always calm, always measured. The family gradually adjusted their behavior around me, unconsciously deferring to the one they had once dismissed. My sister, predictably, attempted resistance. She tried to reassert control over decisions, tasks, and even conversations. But by now, I had learned how to redirect her energy without confrontation. A smile, a subtle pause, a carefully worded suggestion. These small actions diffused her challenges and reinforced my own position. She was forced to navigate around me, her authority quietly undermined by the calm competence I wielded so effortlessly. I also strengthened alliances within the household. Cousins, previously complicit in teasing or ignoring me, now began seeking my advice. Parents relied on my observations and insight more than ever. Even the servants and extended family members adjusted to my presence, deferring to me in subtle ways. Every interaction reinforced my position, building a network of unspoken acknowledgement that I was no longer the burden they had declared me to be. To cement my authority further, I began to manage the household's routines strategically. I arranged schedules, coordinated chores, and anticipated conflicts before they could arise. Each successful intervention reinforced the perception of my competence and calm judgment. The family's dependence on me grew naturally, almost imperceptibly, until it became impossible to ignore. One evening, my sister tried a subtle test. She questioned a small decision I had made regarding a family gathering, hoping to provoke a reaction or undermine my authority. I remained composed, explaining the rationale calmly and politely. My parents nodded in approval, and my sister was left with no argument. Her failed attempt underscored the shift. My influence was now deeply embedded in the household's rhythm, and her challenges were increasingly ineffectual. I continued to act with patience and precision, never revealing the full extent of my strategy. Authority, I had learned, is most powerful when it appears effortless. My quiet dominance reshaped conversations, guided decisions, and subtly redirected attention toward me. By the end of the week, even my sister's friends treated me with a mixture of respect and caution, sensing the undercurrent of influence I now commanded. The final stage of consolidation was psychological. I allowed my sister to believe she still had control over minor matters, while in reality I guided the outcomes. She adjusted her words, her tone, and her actions to align with my subtle direction. Parents, cousins, and extended family began to trust my judgment implicitly. Every task I completed, every suggestion I offered reinforced the undeniable truth: I was no longer a burden. I was indispensable. By now, the household's energy had completely shifted. Conversations, decisions, and routines moved through me like a quiet current. My sister's previous dominance had been replaced by subtle deference, respect, and acknowledgement of my capabilities. The quiet burden had become the household's steady axis, guiding without overt control, shaping without confrontation, and influencing without visible effort. As I moved through the rooms that evening, I felt a profound satisfaction. The consolidation was complete. My sister's challenges had been neutralized, my influence firmly established, and the family's perception of me irreversibly transformed. The burden they had once dismissed was now the foundation upon which the household rested. And in that quiet, steady authority, I realized the truth I had long known: strength does not always roar. Sometimes, it grows unseen, patiently, deliberately, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The household had witnessed the awakening of the quiet force they had underestimated, and from this point forward, it would guide every step, every word, and every decision. The burden was gone. The power remained, calm, measured, and absolute. The day had come when the household could no longer deny the transformation. Weeks of subtle shifts, quiet interventions, and deliberate patience had culminated in a truth that could no longer be ignored. I was no longer the burden my sister had shouted about at dinner. I had become indispensable, respected, and quietly in command, a force of competence and calm that reshaped the home's rhythm. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the atmosphere felt different. There was still polite conversation, the clink of cutlery, and the hum of background chatter, but a subtle tension lingered. Everyone seemed to recognize, perhaps unconsciously, that something fundamental had changed. My sister, who had once ruled these moments with loud declarations and sharp words, now approached the table cautiously, her confidence muted, her gestures carefully measured. I smiled softly, maintaining the calm exterior that had carried me through countless trials. The family's attention naturally fell toward me. Parents glanced at my place setting before making decisions, cousins awaited my input on minor disputes, and even my sister, previously so certain of her dominance, found herself seeking subtle confirmation in my reactions. The reversal was complete. Influence no longer rested in her hands. The first test of recognition came when a minor disagreement arose over the table arrangements. My sister tried to assert her usual authority, suggesting changes she assumed would be unquestioned. I spoke with quiet clarity, offering a simple, reasoned alternative. The room shifted immediately. Parents nodded, cousins murmured agreement, and my sister's face reflected a mixture of disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement. The household now deferred, naturally and effortlessly, to my judgment. It was not the loud triumph I had imagined in the early days. Authority, I had learned, was most effective when it appeared effortless. Each recommendation I made, each decision I guided, carried weight because it was measured, thoughtful, and calm. No one questioned my competence, not now, not ever again. My sister's words at that infamous dinner had lost their sting entirely. Her attempts to dominate now fell flat, shadowed by the undeniable evidence of my ability. In the days that followed, recognition deepened. Parents sought my guidance openly, valuing my observations and insight. Cousins deferred to me in planning household events, while my sister's interventions were increasingly perfunctory. Her confidence diminished. Even extended family members who had once overlooked or underestimated me, now approached me with respect, seeking my advice on matters they would have previously ignored. My sister, confronted by the undeniable truth of my competence and calm authority, tried in private to regain footing. But each effort was anticipated, subtly countered, or quietly redirected. She could no longer challenge me without exposing her own insecurity. Every attempt at influence I allowed her was carefully managed to reinforce my position, ensuring the household's perception of authority remained intact. The culmination of this transformation came during a family meeting. My sister began to outline plans for an upcoming event, expecting the usual compliance or polite nods. I spoke, calmly offering an organized, efficient, and thoughtful alternative. Parents, cousins, and household members immediately recognized the merit of my approach. My sister faltered, her words trailing into silence. The acknowledgement was clear. I had earned the family's trust, respect, and confidence in a way that could no longer be contested. Finally, in the quiet aftermath, the household settled into a new rhythm. My sister no longer dominated, my parents relied on my judgment, and every corner of the home moved with a subtle acknowledgement of my authority. The burden they had once scorned was gone. In its place stood a figure of calm competence, capable of shaping the household's life without confrontation or overt assertion. I walked through the rooms with the serene satisfaction of one who has earned recognition through patience, observation, and strategic action. The family, once a stage for ridicule and dismissal, had been transformed. My sister's previous dominance was now a memory, her sharp words and accusations muted by the weight of my quiet authority. The household respected me, deferred to me, and, most importantly, could not imagine life without my presence guiding it. And in that recognition, I understood the full measure of my journey. Strength does not need to roar. True influence is cultivated in silence, honed through observation, and solidified through patience. I had taken the burden they had tried to cast aside and transformed it into an undeniable force. The final image was simple but profound. I sat at the head of the table, calm, composed, smiling softly, while the household, including my once dominant sister, moved around me in acknowledgement of a power that had always been mine, quiet, measured, and unassailable. The burden was gone. Authority had arrived. And the household, forever changed, would never forget it.